Next, let's talk about inheritance, making a class that's partially based on an existing class. And there's some new terminology here. The existing class is sometimes called the parent class, and then the new class is called the child class. Other times, the existing class is called the superclass, and the new class is called the subclass. Or sometimes the existing class is called the base class, and the new class is called the extended class. All three of those are used. In particular, parent class, child class, or superclass, subclass are used interchangeably, and there's no consistency in which term is used. When you make a class that is a child class, or a subclass, or an extended class, all of the non-private stuff, in other words, the public methods, of the parent class are available to you, and you don't need to have any special syntax to call them. So, for example, if I make a child class, I say extends to designate the parent class. Inside the body of this child class, I can now call any of the public methods of parent class, and I call them the same way I would call a locally defined method. So the whole point is to support the number one main goal of object-oriented programming, which is save you from having to write the same code or nearly the same code twice. And if the child class would have to repeat all the code in the parent class, and then you changed your mind, you would have had to change it both places, and these sorts of changes build up and multiply exponentially. So you can design these class hierarchies so that the shared behavior is kind of trickles down this class hierarchy and doesn't have to be repeated. Before we do a more complicated example with the ship class, let me give you a very simple example. So suppose I made a class called person, and it has two public methods, get first name and get last name. Notice that both of those methods are public, so outside code can access it. Then I make a child class called employee, and it extends person. The employee class can define some of its own methods like get salary or get employee info. But inside the body of the employee class, it can call the methods that came from the person, and no special syntax is required. Get first name and get salary are called exactly the same way. You don't need to somehow distinguish between calling public methods that were inherited and calling public methods that were defined locally. Also notice that I didn't even define a constructor. If you don't define constructors, you get a zero-argument constructor for free, and this is true both for standalone classes and classes that have a parent. So the simple case is you just say extends. The public methods from the parent class are available in the child class with no special syntax required, and you do not have to do anything funny with constructors. That's a simple case. Understand, get used to the simple case first before you move on and look at the more complicated case that we'll look at momentarily, where you have some naming conflicts. In the simple case, inherited methods are called with no special syntax, and nothing special is needed for constructors. Be sure you understand that simple case, the person and employee examples on the previous slide, before you look at this more complicated case. But there are a lot of more complicated cases that require the use of super. Super can be used in two ways. First, it can be used as though it were a method call on the first line of a constructor. Second, super can be used as though it were a variable name inside the body of a local method that overrides or shadows an inherited one. Let's look at the first use of super first. So I make a class called speedboat. That's a subclass, a child class, an extended class of ship. And speedboats are like ships, but they also have, I don't know, maybe colors. And the first use of super is as a method call on the first line of a constructor. So when a speedboat is built, of course the system internally has to first build a ship and then kind of augment it, build it out further. The question is, how does it build a ship? And the answer is, if you don't say otherwise, Java will build the parent class by calling a zero-argument constructor. But the problem is that ship doesn't have a 0-argument constructor. It has a 1-argument constructor and a 5-argument constructor. Well, Java wouldn't know which constructor to use, and even if it knew which one to use, it wouldn't know what arguments to pass to it. So you have to tell it. So inside the speedboat constructor, you need to say, call the 1-argument constructor of the superclass of ship. And here you say, oh, call the 5-argument constructor of the parent class of ship. So this is only necessary, super on the first line of a constructor, as if it were a method call. That use of super is only necessary when you're not satisfied calling the 0-argument constructor of the parent class. If you're satisfied with calling the 0-argument constructor of the parent class, don't say super parentheses. Just don't say anything at all, because the default behavior is to call the 0-argument constructor of the parent class. All right, this is pretty common. It's quite normal for classes to lack 0-argument constructors and to have multiple constructors. So I would say half the time, or maybe a third of the time, you will need to use super on the first line of your constructor to designate which parent class constructor is called. So that one's pretty common, using super on the first line of a constructor as if it were a method call. This one is quite uncommon, using super as though it were a variable name. This is just to resolve name conflicts. If inside the body of print location, I just called print location, I'd just have an infinite recursive loop, and it would just go forever until the stack overflowed, and it would crash out of memory or something like that. So in this particular case, I have a locally defined method called print location and an inherited one called print location, and I want to distinguish between the two. So again, remember that normally calling a method from the parent class does not require the use of super. You just use the method name. But if there's a name conflict and you have a locally defined method and an inherited method that are exactly the same, and you want to call both, then you've got to distinguish between them, and you use the word super as if it were a variable name. So the use of super in the constructor is quite common, maybe a third of the time, possibly as much as half the time. The use of super as a variable name is quite rare. I would say maybe less than 5% of the time will you need that. And just like the this variable, don't use the super variable unless you need it. Don't stick the word super dot, super dot, super dot in front of all the method calls to the inherited methods. It's not necessary, and in fact, it's considered a bad practice to do that. All right, so once I make a speedboat, then I can test it out by calling the constructors and the methods. The outside code can also call inherited methods or locally defined methods with the same syntax. And then I can get some output just as I did before.